these are some data which you may have seen before, and it's polarizations associated with seeing the outgroup as closed-minded, unintelligent, lazy, so a wide range of categories, but in particular, there's a moral component, right? You see that your outgroup as dishonest or more moral, and as we've been discussing, these moral distinctions can lead to heightened emotions. So most of us know, I think, so far from what we've covered, that emotions can act as moral barometers, right? Now, they're not always the case. Emotions can serve many functions, but in a political context, emotions do tend to take on a moral tone. And as we've been talking about a bit, and some of my questions reflect, I'm interested in which emotions are most operative in which contexts and why, as an emotion scientist. So there's different kinds of moral emotions, and there's different schemes for organizing them. These have been around for some time. So there's other condemning, there's self-conscious, there's other praising, self-praising, other suffering. And so I'm just placing this here to indicate there's a wide range of emotions that are implicated in morality and likely also in politics. And from my perspective as an emotion scientist, we've understudied the emotional complexity inherent in politics. So here's one paper that came out this year, an American psychologist, and it's kind of interesting in a few ways because they look not just at the US, that's what's in this image, but also in the UK and Europe. And they basically find that there's this large increase in negative emotions independently of politics. Things like fear, anger, sadness, and depression in their research are on the rise in these countries and globally. And at the same time that that's on the rise, you see an increase in populism. And the rise in negative affectivity does predict voting for populist candidates and endorsing their positions. So there is some large scale tracking in affective changes at a large scale and how people are responding to democracies around the world. And this is probably reciprocal and dynamic, so we can get into that. Whether the negative affect's a result of the politics or is triggering it, it's probably both. But this just sets the stage for what I wanted to cover today, because most of the studies focus on a few negative emotions. The diversity of positive emotions has been underappreciated, I think. So we conducted two large national longitudinal studies online during the 2024 presidential election, about 5,000 people. And for today, I'm just going to cover emotions that were surveyed and voting behavior, but we have many other variables in our data set that we're interested in looking at. And as I've kind of alluded to, we're interested in emotion specificity and emotional complexity. So not just that positive emotions or negative emotions matter or that bad is stronger than good, which sometimes is the case, but are there specific emotion effects when you drop many emotions simultaneously in a model? Um, so Study one was a convenient sample. So there was a political podcast that is supposed to be center, but what you tend to get is Democrat leaning folks and independent leaning folks that are part of the listenership there. So you can see the other groups are smaller. The study two helps address that issue in a representative panel. So I'm just going to cut right to the models because there's a few different models I want to share. And I know this is the last talk. So far we've just run multiple regression. We're planning on running structural equation models, but haven't gotten to that yet. And so basically what you see here is in step one, this is voting for Trump. So which emotions are most predictive of voting for Trump? We have awe towards Trump, hope towards Trump, and joy towards Trump. That's in step one. In step two, we added negative emotions towards Harris to see if that provided incremental predictive validity. And there you have anxiety towards Harris, anger towards Harris, and contempt towards Harris. So you have got three positive and three negative emotions simultaneously in the model. And then we included demographic factors. Okay, so what do we find in this model? Hope stands out with a pretty large effect considering all the other variables in the model. in many studies I've run before looking at hope and other emotions predicting outcomes. This is it's a pretty large effect. Joy is still there, but you can see considerably smaller. Awe flipped the sign from what we had predicted. That's kind of an interesting sub-finding, happy to talk about. Awe can be mixed valence, so there's kind of a fear and trembling side to awe, in addition to the kind of sublime inspirational component. And so I think there might be something complex going on there with awe, which is something we're going to look into more. Contempt stands out in terms of the negative emotions, contempt for Harris. Then you have anger and anxiety towards Harris. And then again, this is all predicting voting for Trump. So the two biggest predictors emotionally of voting for Trump in study one were hope towards Trump and contempt towards Harris. So you do get emotion specificity, and this is pretty naturally controlling for valence because you have positive and negative emotions in the same model. Um, and we can get to this if we have time. What does this mean, right? That one emotion is predicting more than another. What does that say about what's going on in the mind of a voter when they decide to vote? Okay. So now I'm going to provide the same results for Harris, and then do the same thing in study two. So this is the same design, except in this case, it's positive emotions towards Harris and negative emotions towards Trump, but it's the same emotions. And it's the same stepwise model. So you have positive emotions only, then positive plus negative, and then positive, negative, and covariates. And I'm just going to report on the third model because everything's in there. Um, so similarly, hope stands out again among the positive emotions. Joy is significant. It's quite small. You may remember that there was a time during the Harris campaign where joy was kind of part of their theme, in the narrative. It doesn't look like that mattered that much. And awe, again, shows this reverse effect. Contempt is significant again, as well as anger and anxiety. And in this case, anxiety about Trump was the biggest negative emotional predictor, and the biggest positive emotional predictor was hope again. So hope is consistently, we'll see this in study two, an important predictor. And here you have a range of negative emotions with anxiety on top here. So again, to our emotion specificity argument, a wide range of emotions seem to matter in predicting voting behavior, which is also why I'm interested in how news algorithms and other factors are driving these emotions towards the candidates, since these emotions seem to be importantly mediating the voting behavior. So study two, we basically ran the same analysis, but we have a representative sample this time and more politically balanced. And we included more emotions, just to try to get even more granular with which emotions matter. So I'm going to present basically the same kind of models, and then I'm happy to take some questions here. So in this case, you may notice we added a few emotions. So here we have compassion, hope, awe, pride, and joy. So we've got 5 positive emotions here. And then in the second step of the model, we added negative emotions. And here we have contempt, anxiety, shame, anger, and sadness. So this gets a little bit better at the range of emotions that are out there. Not to get into that discussion, but there are various debates on how many emotions there are, but a lot of current models suggest there's at least 20 to 30. Um, and so we're trying to approximate that complexity as reasonably as we can in this kind of model without oversaturating it. And then we have the same controls. One difference is we included party affiliation this time, because we have better representation across the categories to do so. But I will note it correlates highly with sentiment towards candidates and voting behavior. So there's a bit of a highly correlated predictors issue with the model. Um, okay, so what do we find in this case? Hope, again, is a major positive emotional predictor. Um, Awe shows this inverse effect again, which is interesting, because it was unexpected, but it's continued to replicate. And anger also comes out as significant towards Harris. So hope for Donald Trump and anger towards Harris were the two biggest emotional predictors here in this model. And then awe showed the inverse pattern. None of the other emotions stood out. Part of the issue in this study may be the smaller sample size, so we may have less power to detect the smaller effects we could in study one, but some of the main patterns are replicating. And you can see party plays a big role in predicting voting behavior. Okay, so this is the final model I'm going to present. This is the same thing, but the inverse of what we just looked at. So this is emotions predicting voting for Harris versus voting for Trump. And here, again, we have positive emotions towards Harris, as well as negative emotions towards Trump to see which is most predictive, including our covariates. All right, so what do we find in this case? Hope comes out again, so there's a clear pattern there. Awe continues to show this inverse relationship than what we expected, and anger is significant again, and party is highly predictive. So we did run the models without party, and some of the other emotions are predictive when you remove that because they're correlated with party affiliation, which I'm happy to talk about. But I'm just going to kind of summarize the main pattern here, given where we are with time. So we found that all emotions in study one, predictive voting behavior, and the effect sizes varied quite a bit within valence, suggesting emotion specificity matters and is probably a helpful way of thinking about the role emotions are playing in voting behavior and probably political attitudes more broadly. We actually have data on that I'm not presenting today. So just to summarize the emotions that stood out, hope for Trump and contempt for Harris were the top predictors of voting for Trump in 2024 in our convenience sample. And then anxiety about Trump and contempt for Trump, as well as hope for Harris, were the top predictors of voting for Harris. So there is a parallel, right, where we see contempt and hope are particularly important in driving voting behavior, with the note that anxiety about Trump matters a bit as well in study one. Okay. So study two, just to summarize what we found, it's similar. We found hope for Trump and anger for Harris were the biggest predictors of voting for Trump. And kind of mirror image, hope for Kamala and anger at Trump were the main predictors of voting for Kamala. So it did switch from contempt to anger from study one to two, which is kind of interesting. I'm not sure why that's the case. So I will say, though, that overall, despite the bad is stronger than good effect that's been established in other studies, it was very clear in our data, no matter how you model it, that hope is the biggest predictor consistently of voting behavior for either candidate above and beyond all the other emotions and covariates, which I think is nice and interesting because from the perspective of this conference, just focusing on contempt and outrage and disgust and a lot of negative moral emotions, hope actually seems to be really potent and powerful as well and adds a layer to the story. There's potentially a mechanism there, right, for positive political change, which we've seen historically, right, with prior political periods. So, yeah, so in the context of rising negative affect and political polarization, I think hope matters actually more now than it ever has. And people are craving it. It elicits people's imaginations about realizing their dreams, and what is possible. And that's very powerful politically, maybe even more so than contempt and anger. And this literature is understood already, but contempt and anger are about usually responses to injustice and unforgivable moral violations. So that's kind of the main pattern we found. And I'm going to run SEM models. We're going to model the emotion data in different ways. We'll control for valence. And there's a number of moderators that we want to look at, like social capital, political identity centrality, SDO, and so on. And so looking forward to working on that. And if you have any thoughts or ideas or questions, I'm happy to chat. Thank you.
All right, so there is a cool thread running on the chat online between other people who are on the panel. So I'll try to briefly summarize it and encourage you to respond. For those of you who are here in person, if you need to step out, please feel free to do so. So Fadi says, great talk. Whether is there any evidence for linearity in your models since these motions are pretty correlated with one another? Um, Billy followed up and asked whether the multiclinearity was greater for negative versus positive emotions in the model.
Hmm. Yeah, so this is always a challenge when looking at emotion specificity, which is why I'm looking forward to getting into the structural equation models where you can run different factor structures versus what I ran today. Multicollinearity is certainly in part an issue, but what I will probably do is you can use a bifactor model where you have basically valence and then emotion specific effects, and then you run those separately. Um, the other thing you can do is basically run subsets if there's a meaningful subset to run, or you just reduce the dimensionality, right? If certain emotions like contempt and anger cluster together, given common appraisals and effects. But it continues to be a tricky issue. I will say, no matter how you model it, though, like the main effects that I presented are consistent. You just get more emotions matter when you run them one at a time. And you lose that when you put them together because of the shared valence.
Great. And the
Oh,
other,
and whether positive, negative, I don't think that was an issue. I think culinary is probably an issue with both positive and negative emotions. People tend to differentiate among negative a little bit more than positive, but not as much as you would think.
and the last question then is a second one from Fadi Ida, who's saying he's interested in whether you separate contempt from anger, since at least some theorists argue that contempt is viewed by some as a combination of anger and disgust. And then
Mm,
Billy had a follow up about whether when you combine hope and contempt, you might get some kind of motivation that is emergent and
mm,
can't be understood simply as hope and contempt. So sort of like how
yeah.
does contempt dovetail with anger and disgust and hope in some of this work?
Yeah, really interesting. That's an interesting idea when we're thinking about how to model the affective data that I hadn't considered before with combining hope and contempt or hope and anger. Yeah, I mean, there's long-standing debates about this, and actually, Ira Roseman, who's written some papers on this, I did my master's with him many years ago now, but he wrote an interesting paper called "Beat Them or Ban Them," which is anger versus contempt, which I point some folks to. I think there's probably newer data now, but there are arguably different appraisals that underlie those emotions. And when you want to get to a fine-grained distinction between emotions, the most precise variable you have typically is the cognitive appraisal or assessment of the situation that leads you to feel one emotion versus another. And contempt really is more about such a severe violation that it's unforgivable and it triggers banishment. Whereas anger is response to an immoral behavior that requires an action and to be rectified, but you can then potentially repair the relationship and the community. Whereas contempt is kind of maybe a scaled up level of anger for it's preserved for much more severe violations. And of course, in our evolutionary past, if you got to the level of contempt and you were excluded from the community, social death basically meant physical death as well. And of course, it operates differently now. But they do correlate with each other in our data, but they're not fully overlapping. So I do think the distinction's worth preserving.
So one last question. One of our later panelists, Mark Brandt, is asking, in addition to voting for Harris or Trump, voters could choose not to vote. Have you thought about emotions that would be relevant for choosing not to vote and participate?
Mm,
Which might
yeah.
interestingly tune with Chris's talk from earlier in the panel.
Yeah, well, so we have that too. Most of the people in our, especially in study one, study two, we do have some people that didn't vote. I don't know if we have enough people who didn't vote to properly model that, which is interesting. But it is something to think about. Right. Like, yeah, if you're so contemptuous of all politicians, so angry that you just disengage completely, it's an interesting question and something I'd be happy to look into.
And I was just kidding. There is one last question, and then folks can break and get some lunch and some snacks. So Sanaz has something in the Q&A that directly building off that very point is asking, why do you choose to focus on emotions towards the candidates rather than generalized emotions or emotions towards things like the economy or towards immigration?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a number of ways of modeling it. We actually have general emotions data as well. And there's actually even more emotions in that measure than the ones I included so far. I think there's maybe 15 emotions there. So we basically haven't run those analyses. We're going to look at those too, but generally what you find is affect that's specific to a particular context and area tends to be more predictive of the thing in that context and area for obvious reasons, right? It's more relevant to the outcome of interest, tends to drive the behavior. So especially if you're going to parse among various emotions, it helps to drop them simultaneously in the model when they're focused on that context. The other thing I'll say, without going into the whole methodology of measuring emotion, is our emotional memories tend to be better when you have a contextual cue. If you have general emotional information, you get a lot of trait things, just how people tend to be. Whereas if you narrow it to a specific context, you tend to get quote unquote more accurate affective information. And so those are a couple of reasons why we do it that way. But just in case, we also measured it more generally, and we will run the comparison to see if there's differences.
Well, great. Thank you, James, and thank you all four of you for
Thank you.
your talks. I think it's interesting to consider, yeah, the different discrete emotions, how we regulate them in different online contexts.